economic uncertainty, shareholder activism, regulatory interventions, antitrust restrictions, tax troubles, which amongst these challenges could slow down the global deal economy.
What we see, as many of these deals are global in nature, is actually the challenge of getting it through, in particular, merger control review in so many jurisdictions. And if you look at Facebook, WhatsApp, you realize sort of the complexity that this can give rise to. If you look at Europe, you would expect a big major transaction like that to sit squarely in Brussels and be reviewed by the European Commission, sort of on a one-stop shop basis for the whole of Europe. Now, it appears that they will actually miss the financial thresholds that trigger European merger control, and so you might actually end up with sort of up to 29 sort of local filing requirements. That might still bring it back to Brussels to consolidate all those filings, but what it does show is that a lot of these transactions that ultimately need to sort of pass through many gates, and it may actually be very difficult in a situation where regulators try to prove their mettle to sort of convince sort of regulators in secondary jurisdictions, and I don't think of any of those represented in this circle, but sort of really smaller countries which are sort of faced with a review like that, and which may, to be honest, create issues locally, to step back and say, we'll wave this through because the global deal is more important than what happens locally. And so I think that sort of in the future will be sort of one of the major challenges facing more global transactions.
Okay, so I guess to the thresholds now they need to add a user threshold, right? Because many of these companies don't take the profit or revenue threshold. Okay. Merger control is young in China as well.
Before we go to merger control filing, I need to give a little bit of positive messages about China. I think in terms of the regulatory hurdles and also the time and the process, the new government has tried to cut it down to be more efficient. So there are more delegations of the authorities to the local governments, and some of the process which require approval now becomes registration or filing. So in terms of the general regulatory approvals, I think it would be simplified. Other than there are two things that the investors probably will be very cautious. The first one is obviously the merger control filing. We have known to be the first one to be filed in China and the last one to come out. However, we have introduced a simple case procedure, which hopefully if they fall within the simple case procedure, it will be a very quick clearance. And the government is talking to us about also reducing the amount of information required by the filing party. Because in the past, people always complain that the government required too many data and is somehow mission impossible. So I think for that part it has been improving. The second one is probably more scary thing is about the national security review. So if there is pure onshore transaction FDI, then some of the transactions you would have to go through the national security review, which creates some uncertainty and fear as to how it goes. But so far, it has been passed for 2 years, and based on our experience, there has no such transaction that has been blocked due to national security review. So it's a process that you have to go through. It's probably sometimes shorter, sometimes longer than merger control filing. But I can only say that to us, for China, the foreign investors seems to be more welcome with the reduction of the approval requirements and time. So I'm very positive about China on that one.
Could I add just a couple of minutes?
Of course.
I think number one, nationalism, actually, just as a sort of international trend, I think there are bothering signs of the rise of nationalism, which affects some degree of enthusiasm and confidence in deal doing. So we might lose Scotland, you've got Ukraine, you've got tensions between China and Japan, you've got Catalonia. So I'm a little worried that nationalist instincts around the world will be, in non-specific ways as yet, unhelpful to confidence in deal doing, thought one. Thought two is tax.
Chris, you couldn't resist that.
Because, I mean, there are good things and bad things. I think people are being quite inventive about using attractive tax jurisdictions to facilitate deals these days. And we see that in Europe with inversion transactions from the States. But also the OECD's focus on the BEPS work that they're doing. I think that could really change quite a large part of the playing field in the way people think about things. Not, I think, not centrally, but it will have some impact when it all plays out.
BEPS was actually on the top of my list of challenges that could potentially hurt M&A, because I think everybody's looking at structures with new eyes.
I would echo what Chris said about nationalism, and I would say in a certain way cross-border global taxation and tax structuring falls into that in a certain way. And it was mentioned this morning by the chairman of SEBI that there's also kind of a great propensity these days for protest and for a feeling in many countries by large parts of the population that something is not right, something is not fair, the system is being gamed by those people who are more successful, by those enterprises who are more successful. I think it's all part of a picture in a certain way, and complicated tax structures in the M&A context that are seen either by nationalists or by populist sections of a country or a company's constituencies, have a potential to backfire.
One of the main challenges, and I'm going to go to tax, one of the main challenges nowadays in Europe is that most of our governments are broke, and they don't want to recognize it, and they keep on living as if they were not. And then, for example, there is more and more red tape. Maybe I know that now I'm sounding more like a fellow citizen of Adam than as a European, but there is more and more red tape. Governments keep on buying, but just imagine that, keeps on buying goods, buying assets that they don't pay. They don't pay in time for sure, and sometimes they don't even pay it. This happened in Spain. Just let me tell you something that I read while coming to India in the plane, which made me think a lot, which is that if you make a list, that list exists, of the largest companies in the world which were created during the last 25-30 years, there is only one from Europe. It's a Spanish one, Inditex,
Zara.
But only one. Something's wrong there.
For a moment when you said you don't know what tax they could impose next, I thought you were talking about India, because I think that's what Mr. Shroff is going to talk about.
No, let's unpack it a bit. So let's talk of an inbound deal with an Indian seller. Tax is not the biggest issue, because if it's a public market deal, it's an STD transaction. If you're able to implement it on the exchange, it's not a deal issue at all. And I think for that type of transaction, the regime is not that unpredictable. I think the facts of Vodafone with a foreign seller, foreign buyer were unique. I'm not seeing too many of those transactions. So whilst Vodafone may be an example of the unpredictability of our system, and that the government can become a bad loser and change the rules of the game retrospectively, sending a bad message on whether you really have a rule of law or not, I think I would put that in a separate box. But on a day-to-day basis, I don't find our transactions constrained by the tax issue. I think the bigger issue I see on deals that we are working on is the fact that so much of our corporate law, not just the Companies Act, but the public market related regulations are work in progress, and it's almost impossible to call them correctly. There's so much ambiguity, and that is actually a constraint, because an incoming investor doesn't want to take any risks. He's looking for certainty, and the only certainty you get is the answer you don't want to hear.